Hey everybody, Dave back here with another episode number 46. We're getting close to that 50 mark. Today we have a physical therapist that was really intriguing to me as I saw his profile on LinkedIn. 2021, all right? We got to use the tools we have to find great people out there. Ari Ginsberg is a physical therapist as well as an Io Psychologist. And that, for people out there that don't know what an Io Psychologist is, you could think of an Io Psychologist as more of a business and organizational related psychologist where they investigate workplace behavior and workplace psychology, as well as psychology in healthcare and the management of healthcare and the interactions in healthcare. And Ari can definitely expand on this, but that's just a layman's understanding of it. The reason I wanted Ari to come on to talk about this is because this is an area that deserves so much more attention. The relationships that we have in healthcare, meaning patient, clinician, doctor, patient, physical therapist, patient, and even colleague to colleague interactions are what create the experience we have in this rehab space. And what's more important when you're in the rehab setting than to connect well with the person you're working with for the best outcome? So I really want to focus in this episode on the experience you have in rehab for both the clinician and the patient, and get deep into the psychology behind some of the things we didn't realize affect the outcome, our satisfaction as a patient, and our ability to get the outcome we want as a clinician. So without further ado, here is Ari Ginsberg with Body Psychology. Ari, welcome.
You.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Ari, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate you allowing me to be on your podcast, and I look forward to sharing many of my insights with your audience.
I am really looking forward to it. So let's just jump into it. I call it the bottom line up front. What is the bottom line up front of Body Psychology?
Yeah, so I started a company a little bit ago, not that long ago, called Psychology for the Body, and my website is psychologyforthebody.com. The whole idea of Psychology for the Body is to recognize how psychology can play an integral role in terms of not just our interactions with our patients and their satisfaction and clinical outcomes, but also with self-care as clinicians. And I wanted to share insights in that field through continuing education, coaching, trying to help people find the career that they're looking for, also leadership coaching, and also consulting on many of the IO issues that I think are relevant in physical therapy and rehab in general.
I love that. I think it's so important. Can you give us a little background, the professional version of what Io Psychology is?
Sure. So Io Psychology stands for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. It's what you mentioned before in the introduction. A lot of it is about improving business productivity, using psychology to improve, let's say, job satisfaction. So if you're a manager, this is one example, and you want to reduce your absenteeism and your turnover rate in your business. I work in home care, so I've noticed that in my branch alone, there's a tremendous turnover. There's a lot of burnout. So you would use psychology to find out what could improve the job experience for the clinicians and prevent turnover. Another element which I'm focused on and I'm passionate about is customer satisfaction. The same way in any business, you would want your customers to be satisfied, and you can use psychological principles to improve satisfaction. I think that the same concepts could be applied to rehab, physical therapy, and improve patient satisfaction.
That's a great explanation, and it's an area that you seem to be a leader in. I haven't seen too many other people doing this. Tell us, are there many other Aris out there that are becoming psychologists that are physical therapists, specifically Io psychologists, I guess?
So from what I've found on through social media, there's really not that many people. I've actually met another individual named Nathan, who we're collaborating right now on a future offering coming out hopefully in February. He's in a master's program right now, and he should be finishing next semester. I just finished my master's, and we're working on a collaboration of continuing education. He's going to be dealing with the leadership components and how transformative leadership is really something that's critical and missing and lacking in physical therapy. And I'm going to be focusing more on burnout, the causes of burnout, and how to recognize the signs and preventing burnout in physical therapy. So there's another individual. And also a lot of people have reached out to me, and I'm open to this as well through LinkedIn, to ask me about the field. I actually just interacted with an OT who works in New York, and she's also interested in going into IO, but she hasn't started yet. So I try to give her insights. So there's definitely some interest in it, but I don't think many rehab clinicians are in the field of IO yet.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. I actually myself listened to one of your webinars, and I thought it was absolutely great. It was awesome to be able to learn about the piece of patient satisfaction and how to improve that through your webinar, and being able to actually get the CEU after watching. And it's amazing that it's a free webinar. We'll definitely throw that up in the show notes so the clinicians out there can check it out. And even if you're a student, I think there's a ton of value, because you should be learning about these things. This is what will stand out in an interview when you talk about your education on improving satisfaction. So definitely check it out if you haven't. And I commend you for collaborating with the other people you're finding out there, such as Nathan, because in this day and age, as a clinician, we really do need to separate ourselves from the pack, because we're all online. It's funny, a year ago I thought I was ahead of the curve, and now I realize that I'm just, another person putting my brand out there. And I think personality and your unique abilities are more important than ever before. So it's important to do that with other people that are also in that same direction, because there's strength in numbers, and also there's growth in that. So I commend you for finding Nathan and collaborating with him. I'm excited for that piece. Let's go a little bit into social psychology. You talked to me a lot about that during our first few meetings. I want this to be beneficial for patients and clinicians, but talk a little bit about how social psychology plays heavily into this experience we have with in the rehab setting.
Sure. So I love social psychology. I've been passionate about it for several years now. If you're familiar with a little psychology, originally I used to enjoy more psychoanalytic theory, which is tied to Freud, more of an idea that psychology is best studied when a person goes into their unconscious and tries to go through their past. And then, of course, there's another aspect of psychology called behavioral psychology, which is trying to figure out a way to control behaviors and improve behaviors that are damaging.
Right.
But social psychology is really premised on this concept of heuristics and biases, which I speak about in my webinar. And from a simplistic level, heuristics are basically shortcuts that people make, quick decisions, quick impressions that people have of other people, other things. For example, you might see a large house and assume that if somebody has a large house, they must be rich. So these are quick shortcuts that we make in our minds, because it's possible that the person isn't rich who owns the house, but we assume, our minds make these quick judgments, and then they create these biases. And a bias is called a systematic mistake, because we assume that anybody who has a large house is rich. But in reality, if you did your research and you spend time looking this up, it might be that the person isn't really rich, and maybe they inherited the house and that's all they have. There's no furniture in there. So we make these judgments all the time with regard to everything that we encounter in society, and sometimes they're mistaken, but most of the times they're correct. I would say 99% of the time they're correct, but a lot of times they're not correct. And these exist in society, and understanding the way people think about the world, the way people have an impression of you as a clinician, and understanding how they think is really an incredible piece of knowledge to improve patient satisfaction. So that's one aspect of social psychology that I really try to focus on in my webinars. And that's what I love. I love the idea that most people believe that they're completely rational and objective about everything they encounter. But the premise of social psychology is the opposite, that really we make quick decisions, and it's not really a flaw necessarily. It's just part of our nature. And just to go into more detail, hopefully that's okay, I think it's an evolutionary benefit because from an evolutionary standpoint, we make decisions to survive, and you don't have time to make informed decisions in every situation. You have to make quick decisions. So this is part of our nature. Part of human nature is to make these quick decisions based on impressions, and these are common, and everyone has them. And most people think, no, I'm not like that. I don't think like that. I don't have these biases, but everyone does. So I've always been interested in social psychology because it kind of strips away our belief that we're completely rational all the time, but it also helps you understand the way you think about the world and understand where your biases lie and perhaps be aware of them, and also the way other people think and how you can understand and utilize that knowledge to improve the connections you make with other people and improve their satisfaction, like in physical therapy.
It's an interesting topic, talking about bias and heuristics. I didn't know much about heuristics, or I haven't heard that term in a while until we spoke previously. The one that a few that stand out, I try and think of one on each side, one for the patient, one for the clinician. For the patient, I think one of the heuristics that might be dominant is they see their clinician and they look at the shape they're in, or they look at the athletes or the individuals. I don't want to say just athletes because I know you work in a home care setting. They look at the outcomes that they've had with other people or who else is coming in, and that can create a huge bias. And that's actually one of the I don't want to call it an issue, but it's one of the things that's going on now with social media, and we assume they're working with these high-performing athletes, so they are a great clinician. So I think that's one thing that I've noticed on that side. In terms of the clinician, we tend to put people in buckets. We're actually even taught to put our patients in buckets, and based on the experience of other patients that we've had. So sometimes we're a little quick to assume that this patient is going to behave or rehab in a certain way. And on my side of the thing, because obviously I was attracted to doing this podcast with you because my interest of psychology and how this mental model of rehab can be so helpful, that I've come up with being present, being able to kind of tune out some of the noise in terms of, I want this outcome, I want to do this treatment, I want this outcome as the patient, and kind of just being present with the relationship and the communication. So, like, what are the first steps in terms of, like, being aware of these biases?
Yeah, that's a great question. Excellent question. So the first, I think the first step in being aware of the biases is to study bias. And the best books that I would recommend, the books that I love the most on these topics, one of them is called Thinking Fast and Slow. Mm-hmm. And it's a very popular book. It was written by Dr. Daniel Kahneman, and he won a Nobel Prize, I believe in economics, but him and another psychologist, Dr. Amos Tversky, they basically developed the field of social psychology, and they both won Nobel Prizes. I think they're the first psychologists to ever win a Nobel Prize. So their book discussing these biases, it's really important to understand the common ones, because as much as we think we're unique and we're different from other people, these biases exist. So being aware of what the biases are is the first step to understanding your own biases. So be aware of which biases are out there. And then the other books I would recommend, which are really fun books, one is called Influence by Cialdini. It's really another book on social psychology. It's really for marketing, but I was part of one of my webinars, which is I'm giving this Thursday on home exercise programs, is really taking an understanding of how marketers can be successful and using the psychology behind it to improve adherence to home exercise programs. So Influence is a great book. And another book that I love is called Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. And that was also a New York Times bestseller. Fantastic book, recommend. He's an MIT, he works at Duke now, but he's an MIT professor, he was. And he does all these little experiments with these MIT students, some of the brightest individuals in the world, and he shows how even the brightest have the same biases as everyone else, and we're no different from one another. So if you want to understand your own bias, you have to be aware of the common biases and accept the fact that you probably fit into the norm, and you have those as well. And just understanding what they are will make you more aware, and that's the first step in trying to at least affect your biases and be more objective.
Thanks for sharing those books. I'm sure a lot of people on both sides would love to dive into some of the psychology behind some of this. So you, as a clinician that you got your degree in Io Psych. You're now applying it. Tell me a little bit, even from the book Influence, specifically the topic of home exercise program compliance is huge, right? Being able to follow through with the program you're given in the rehab setting. We want that as clinicians. Patients want to be able to develop the habit, the ritual of doing it. Talk to me about how you're applying some of these concepts that you read about, that you've studied in terms of Influence, in terms of just Io Psych as a field, in terms of your experience as a clinician, the application. Let's take home exercise program for.
So, start with home exercise programs. So one of the ideas that in the book Influence is that people create an image of themselves and they want to be consistent within that image. And especially if you commit to something, and I'll give you an example, especially if you commit to something, you're more likely to follow through. So for example, they did a study in this book Influence, they quote a study where a certain charitable organization called people up, and as soon as they called them up, they just said hi to them and they asked them for money. But then they did the same process where this charitable organization called up for money, but they started the conversation with, how are you doing? And the person would automatically say, I'm doing great. And then they would ask them for money. So what they found was that they got a lot more money. The charitable organization got a lot more money when you start the conversation with, how are you doing? And the individual on the other side of the line says, I'm doing great. And the reason is because when a person says they're doing great, they're creating an image of themselves of doing well and being happy and being fine. And then when you ask them for money after that, so they're more likely to give money because they want to be consistent with that image of being great, of doing well, of feeling good about themselves. If you're really doing great, so then you would be willing to give charity. So they found that creating or having people create a self-image of doing great, of being great, is something that's critical for follow through. And another example would be commitment. When a person commits, especially in public, it's another aspect of creating an image of themselves that they're going to want to follow through in order to ensure that their image is true and is honest. So, for example, with home exercise programs, you might want to have the patient. You might want to have them sign a contract, for example, or you might want them to commit in public.
Interesting.
Yeah, you might want to have them sign a contract that basically, if you want me to be your physical therapist, you sign a contract stating that you're going to follow your home exercise programs. Just having them have to commit in public is something that'll create this self-image, and now they'll want to be consistent with that self-image. So that's another example that I give in my webinar on home exercise programs.
I'm excited for that one. That's cool. I never thought of that. So I created an app in 2012 called Video Hab. The biggest thing in my app, besides taking the video and uploading it to the program, people have heard me talk about this on the podcast. I was just like, why don't you just video it and throw it into a database so they could see it, but your video of the patient instead of just some random person? Create that biofeedback. And the idea was get them to log in and, throw in their actual response to the exercise, how they felt, and track it and increase that level of accountability. That's where my head was years ago. And it sounds like with the contract, did you want to say something to that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was just going to say there's a great research article that I bring in my webinar on adherence rates to home exercise programs. And they did this research study where they stuck these accelerometers in weights, in leg weights. Mm-hmm. And they gave these patients, they gave them a home exercise program, and they asked them to write a diary and discuss and describe in their diary which home exercise programs they were doing and how often. But the patients didn't know that there was this accelerometer, this basically this measurement tool to see if they were actually doing their home exercise programs, because the accelerometer would see if the patient was putting it on their leg and actually kicking or doing their exercises. And they found that people lied all the time. So they found that there's a tremendous amount of lying. So as much as we want to believe that our patients are doing their home exercise programs and how important it is, we know that patients lie. So the question is, how do we use psychology to try to influence them, like the book Influence, try to influence them to continue on with their home exercise programs?
So there's one side of it that's social psychology. And by the way, we, in the sports world, this is what we dealt with. We had all these questionnaires, sports science departments were now trying to track and check in with players. And the reliability of it's, questionable because, or the validity, the player wants to appear to be healthy. right? Or in certain circumstances doesn't want to appear to be healthy if they're fearful of their job as an athlete. So you're absolutely right. I guess where I'm most interested is, representing the individual the best I can and being on their team. So on the other side of psychology and more of the more of the counseling model, there's self-determination theory, right? And under self-determination theory, the three, and this is where I'm getting trained up by my mentor in sports psych, the three domains of self-determination theory when you're helping somebody with it's basically all about intrinsic motivation. And the three components are competency, autonomy, and social support. And it's interesting, as you're talking about this on the social side, specifically social support, I think it's so interesting because competency and autonomy are two areas that I feel like in the physical therapy world with home exercise programs, we don't spend enough time being present with and honing in on. So in terms of competency, the idea is to help improve the patient's confidence. But what do? We break them down. We break them down. We break them down. You're doing this wrong. You're not perfect with this. And of course they're fearful of that because, nobody wants to appear to be so bad at something. And then in terms of autonomy, how often do we give our patient a choice? No, just do the straight leg raise. So I'm curious, Ari, you're the expert and you're the Io psychologist here. Expand on this idea that I have.
Oh yeah, so also again, I'm going to discuss this point in this webinar coming up about autonomy, but there is a method of negotiation that works best. And the psychology has shown that when you negotiate, let's say on anything, for example, if you're selling your house and you negotiate, they found that you want to set, this is the most effective way psychologically, you want to set a higher price. Because
job seekers, listen right now.
This is called anchoring. So anchoring is where you set a higher price,
right?
And you want people to believe that the value of your house is what it is. Let's say, so if you start out, most people think, or many people think, that you're better off starting low and then creating a bidding war, but they've shown psychologically the opposite. That really you're going to be much more successful starting out at a higher price. Let's say $1 million if your house is worth. Let's say you really think your house is worth $800,000. Start out at $1 million because what you're expressing to the potential buyers is this is what the value of the house is, and it gets stuck in their mind that it's $1 million house. But then when you negotiate, you want to concede a little bit. You want to show through negotiation that they have a certain level of power over you, that right. You're actually conceding to them. So you can use the same principles in home exercise program. When you develop your home exercise program, you don't want to just give it to them. You want them to negotiate with you because you want them to feel like they're collaborating in creating the program. And then you want to concede and you want to create a little bit of a harsher program, make it a little harder for them. And then when they say, oh, I don't think I could do this one, then you concede to them the same way you would negotiate on a house and selling a house. And you want to be successful in your ability to sell the house. Same thing with your home exercise program. The psychology is that people will follow through when they see that you're willing to concede. So you start out with a harsher version of the home exercise program. You collaborate with your patient. You have them choose the ones they think are most effective and most appropriate. And then you show that you're willing to concede. Once you do that, you create at least you create a higher probability of them following through with their home exercise program. So that's another idea that's brought into this book, Influence, but it's not tied to home exercise programs or physical therapy. But that's where I guess the creativity comes in, which is what I enjoy, taking these principles and trying to find some type of applicability to, let's say, physical therapy in different aspects.
We should role play something out. Just have fun with it. What do you think? Just role play it out for people. You want to try it?
Yeah, we could do it. Yeah, it's fine.
Let's just try that. All right. So let's just come up with a case. So let's say I am back pain, most common cause of disability, right? All right. So I have back pain, and I'm a 35-year-old male. I'm no longer the athlete I once thought I was, and I'm coming in for I'm having pain, with my normal workouts and in the mornings. I started PT with you. Let's use the case being I'm coming in for a session and you're giving me a program, and we'll just role play it out with you giving me, like, let's say 3 or 4 exercises, and you're asking me about or my follow-up session, and you're asking me about my compliance. I come back and I tell you I didn't do any of it. So yeah, so Ari,
So after that, I would say to the patient,
okay.
I would say to the patient in that situation, so what do you think about this home exercise program? Which exercises do you think are most difficult? Which do you think are easiest? And what do you think you can change in this home exercise program that'll make you be more compliant? So the patient looks it over and says, I don't like this exercise, or this is too much. Three sets of 10, 3 times a day is too much. So then I say to them, okay, I'll be willing to change it as long as you're willing to at least sign a contract. It's not the contract. You won't have to pay me anything. And I may attach an incentive to the contract. So I may say, oh, if you fulfill your contract, I'll give you, I don't know, PTs don't want to do this, but I'll give you 5% off your copay or something like that, So don't do, or you can give them a promotional material, just add an incentive. So have them sign a contract, add an incentive, and also show that you're willing to listen to their opinions and be open to changing the home exercise program. So the patient says, it's too hard for me. That's the reason why I'm not compliant. Because you ask them, you explore, why are you not compliant? Oh, it's too much. There's too many exercises and it's too intense. So then you change it and you make it a little less intense, and you have the patient sign a contract saying that they're going to fulfill it, and they'll get a certain reward. They'll get an incentive by doing their home exercise programs. So when you do that, again, you're showing your patient that you're willing to concede, that they're kind of willing, they're collaborators. If not, they're the ones creating the program for themselves. You're just facilitating it. And the other thing is that you're motivating them through an extrinsic motivator and an intrinsic motivator, which is the desire to be consistent. The desire to be consistent because they're signing a contract. Nobody wants to be a liar and break a contract. So you're using psychology to the utmost, to the highest level, in order to improve the probability of your patients doing their home exercise programs. It doesn't mean that you're guaranteed it's going to work, but you want to use the psychology, the knowledge of psychology and the principles to the best of your ability in order to increase the probabilities that your patients will follow their home exercise programs.
I think it's really interesting. I never thought about the contract idea. In terms of authenticity, I know that's a big piece of counseling in terms of being transparent with your clients to a high degree. How do you toe that line in terms of social psychology and some of these principles in terms of, being transparent, authentic, but also kind of leveraging these tools without losing the effectiveness of them?
Excellent. Yeah. So in general with my patients, let's take patient satisfaction, because I give another webinar on patient satisfaction, usually on Monday nights.
Every Monday?
What'd you say?
Every Monday?
The next one is January 11th.
So this podcast...
Not tonight, next week, a week from this podcast.
Okay, cool. This podcast is going to be live on the day of your next Monday webinar. So it'll be the 11th. So everybody, if you're listening today on Monday, January 11th, then check out the best way to get to the webinar. Maybe we can throw up the link to your LinkedIn or there's a landing page. We'll throw that up in the show notes.
Oh, sorry, great. Thank you. Yeah, so authenticity is, of course, if you use these principles and you're not authentic, you're not going to be successful, because the patient will be able to see through what you're trying to do. And the goal of social psychology isn't really, at least to manipulate in any sense of the word. Mm-hmm. The whole goal is that you want to convey how you really feel to your patients. So, for example, I have a patient right now who survived a suicide attempt, which is tremendously, it's a horrible situation. He's very young. He's in his 20s. And I recently posted this on LinkedIn. My goal is to try to connect with him. And it has nothing to do with using or trying to manipulate him for my gain. I want him to get the best outcomes possible. And also, I care about the people that I work with. I have a genuine, caring, empathetic personality. But I want to convey that empathy to my patient. I want to figure out a way that the patient will see how I really feel about them. And that's really important to me, because I really think the patients will do better if they sense that I care about them. If they don't sense it, even if I feel inside that this patient's important to me, they care about me, it doesn't matter. Whatever you do with them, if they can't sense the empathy, if they can't sense the caring, then it's really worthless. So the goal of the social psychology is to try to take what's internal to you and externalize it so the patient can see it and sense it. And so I gave this example of this 20-year-old who had survived the suicide attempt, and I noticed that he's just a really kind sweet, introverted individual, and I really identified with him. And I wanted to connect with him because not because I gain anything from it other than the fact that A, I care about him, he's my patient, and B, I want him to have the best outcomes. So I noticed that he has a guitar under his bed. I don't play guitar, but I do like music. So I started asking him about music, and he's very quiet. He didn't really want to talk, but I started talking to him more, and I was asking him more questions about what music he likes, and he shared something with me. He shared that he liked, Nirvana, and I was talking to him about how when I was a kid, I remember when Nevermind, Nirvana's famous album came out, and
My
how I
first
felt
album.
about it. Yeah, and I was in camp at the time, and I remember listening to it and how awesome it was. So I just started talking to him about it, and now I feel I remember his mother was so excited that he was doing all the physical therapy with me. She was really nervous, and he started doing the stairs, and I was doing things with him that she thought were impossible. And I really honestly believe that the reason why he's able to do that is because he trusts me. And the reason he trusts me is because I'm trying to show him, A, I care about him, and I'm trying to show him through the similar to me effect, which is the social psychology principle. But I'm not using that, even though I'm aware of it. I'm just trying to share with the patient and try to create a bond with the patient because I care about them. And that's really the key. The key is to use the social psychology to convey the care and the empathy that you feel towards the patient and to externalize it. And that's really my goal as a physical therapist, to teach other people how to convey that. Because I've worked with other clinicians and colleagues, and they're just not capable. They are just as dedicated as I am, and they're just as empathetic as I am, but they just don't have the tools. They don't know what words you're supposed to say, how to communicate, what you're supposed to be looking for. They don't have the tools. So it's really important to teach those clinicians how to take their feelings and their care about their patients and externalize them and make it so that the patients can see what you're about and how you care about them.
This is a big topic and a whole thing that deserves its own attention in terms of suicide, in terms of we work with people that suffer from mental illness and suffer from these, a multitude of things, from depression, anxiety, suicide. And I've had an intimate experience with that several times. And in your webinar, you really, you zoom in to the empathy side. And that's, a lot of us go into this field because we are empathetic individuals, especially physical therapy. We say we want to help others. And it's interesting because we're taught some ways to become clinicians, internalize, I want to fix people. And we're still empathetic, but we lose that externalization of empathy. And so it's so interesting that now you're kind of bringing that back out to the surface. I love seeing this shift away from just the modality, the physical modality, and this increase in attention to externalizing, our empathy and using body language. We forget the power of the smile and you mentioned something. I want to make sure we talk. Well, they'll get this in your webinar, but just a little cheat to learn some of the things you'll get in terms of body language, getting lost through Zoom calls, right?
Yeah.
Really important to show your empathy by over-exaggerating, you said.
Exactly. Yeah.
We're on a Zoom call now, so that's a big point. Here's where my mind goes. I don't want to take away from that topic because I think if we rush that, we wouldn't give the attention. But what I do want to, I think is important to talk about are boundaries. So now I'm playing a little bit of like tennis with you. Now we are empathetic. We are making sure we're being authentic. But now it can be tough for a new physical therapist that's just trying to really improve the psychology of what they're doing. Now they might get a little, not too attached, but it might be a little difficult to play the balance of being clinician and also moving on and getting all their caseload going. Now, what do you say there in terms of how they can find that balance?
No, it's a great question again. So I just wanted to add just two points. One is what you're mentioning is also a key for myself in terms of, and I'm sure other clinicians, is a key in terms of burnout. Because burnout is a result of emotional exhaustion sometimes, and we do grow connected to our patients, and it's part of, I know for myself, I get very connected to my patients, and I do have to balance the professional and business aspects of physical therapy. but it does create burnout because you end up creating these connections with patients and then horrible things happen. I've had patients who have had terminal illness,
Sure.
and it's just really hard. And there's a concept in psychology called emotional dissonance, where you see something and you want to say what you're feeling, but you can't to the extreme. So if you see somebody who you're really connected to as a patient and they're sick, you want to be more depressed, but you can't express that to the family because if you do that, then what ends up happening is you lose some credibility. So what ends up happening over time is those emotions get pent up and it creates a lot of burnout and exhaustion.
Wow.
So I just wanted to talk about that point, which is, and I'm giving another webinar on burnout coming up in February. It's not yet advertised.
That should be required. It should be required.
Yeah, well, that's one of the points. How do you deal with that? How do you treat that as a physical therapist? How would you assess this emotional dissonance and how to deal with that? So I try to give different strategies, which in the webinar, as to how to deal with this concept of emotional dissonance. And the other point that you mentioned is that these concepts of how to apply psychology to physical therapy are really important for both new students, but also older therapists. And what we've come across, I know I've spoken to you about this, is that there seems to be a resistance amongst physical therapists. And I've spoken to this other Io psychologist, his name is Nathan, and we found the same thing, which is that therapists seem to think that clinical skills are skills that you go to continuing education courses for because you can always improve and learn a new technique. But they all think, or most therapists, especially older therapists, seem to think that in the other areas, in the non-clinical areas, they seem to be fine with it and they're great with it. But what I've found is that if you want to grow as a physical therapist or any individual, you always want to study and learn more. And there's certainly more information out there, not just in the clinical skills, but also in the non-clinical skills. And that's where my webinars and my coaching, my consulting come in, to try to show physical therapists, whether you're a student coming into the field or already established, how you can improve on the ability to connect with your patients and improve their clinical outcomes. So I think that I'm trying to show that there's a technical analysis, not just in the clinical sense, not just in your hand placement, for example, on a mobilization, but there's just as much technicality and clinical and knowledge and theory that can be applied to the non-clinical aspects. And I think it's really important for both new physical therapists and older physical therapists to take advantage.
You're absolutely right. Burnout is a plague in coaching professions and clinical healthcare professions. I see myself on a little bit more on the coaching side. So I think strength and conditioning coaches suffer from burnout. I see it happening to, a multitude of clinicians. The thing that I have found over the last few years as I work more with psychologists is there's a little bit better strategies psychologists are, I think, taught to deal with this, whether it's the emotional dissonance, because you really connected me when you mentioned that. And I'm thinking, nobody really taught me anything about that. So I want to tell a quick, brief story. When I was working for the St. Louis Cardinals, I had a player that had, I don't want to give too many details away, but he was a non-English speaking player. So there was a little bit of a language barrier, but of course we have plenty of staff that are bilingual. He had pain in a part of his body. I'm going to protect this case as much as possible. And he was trying to advocate for himself, but it's tough, line to tout. Anyway, he ended up having a diagnosis that was much different than originally thought. It ended up being a terminal diagnosis when originally it wasn't thought to be. In any event, my assistant and I were given the task to help with his care. There was surgery involved, whatnot, and it weighed very heavily on me because I was working with all these athletes and dealing with more, musculoskeletal things. And in this situation, it was terminal, or it ended up being terminal. And you want to, like you said, you're trying to be positive, you're trying to advocate for that individual, and it does become pent up. And it can affect, actually, the other side of it is it doesn't only affect your relationship with that patient, where sometimes it can go south too, it also affects your interaction with the other staff. And for me, it pent up so badly that, I'll never forget, I had a meeting and I exploded in the meeting. I kind of was very frustrated that certain things weren't, that I felt, weren't happening. I'm putting myself out there, and I got frustrated, and thinking back, and I'm like, well, really, you want to keep objectivity in conversations professionally. And I got emotional because it was having an effect on me. And it's a real big challenge as a helping profession, as a helping professional, to manage these, because we're not taught. And
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's why there are a lot of strategies that we need to apply. You're right, 100%. You need to teach younger physical therapists and older physical therapists how to address these issues and how to. So again, I understand that, and I identify with the situation that you just raised, because I've had a lot of patients where I feel very close to. I work in home care, and I work in one area, one specific town in New Jersey. And I've been doing that for about 8 years. And when you're in home care for that long, you end up seeing patients sometimes over and over again, because they tend to be, we call them frequent flyers. They'll come on, and then you'll see them a year later. They'll go back to the hospital with a fall. And I've developed such close relationships. They're not personal, of course, they're professional, but there's a personal element. And I feel like my patients have gotten to know me over the years. I have 3 children, and two of my kids are 4 and 7. And ever since I started working in the area that I'm working the last 7-8 years, my patients have seen the growth of my family. They've seen the birth of my children. It's almost like they're a part of my life, and I'm a part of their life, and I hear their stories. And you make these crazy connections and relationships, which are so important for patients to improve and trust you and do their exercises. And I've seen tremendous improved clinical outcomes with these patients. But again, it takes a toll on you emotionally. And sometimes I come home to my wife and I talk to her about it, which is really important to have a supportive home environment. Yeah. But you come home and I have all these emotions, this sadness, for example, like when I talked about this patient who survived a suicide attempt. It's just so sad, because I see this individual, and this is where bias comes in. If you saw this individual on the street, he's a tall guy, good looking, you would say young guy, not, an intelligent, you would say there's no way this guy's depressed. I mean, he seemingly would have everything in the world, at his fingertips. And we have these biases that we judge these people on first impressions. And it really affects me emotionally. And I come home and I talk to my wife about it, thankfully. But we need to address this. It's a really important topic, and that's something that I want to share insight on.
I think thank you for sharing that. What's coming to my mind is, as a clinician, think like a human, not like a clinician, right? So it's like with social psychology, and going back to the human element, the human experience we all have. What do they say? Get out of your head, get into your heart. Well, I mean, I think as a clinician, there's a lot to be said to think like a human and get back to being a human, because I think in school, I don't want to say that we're taught not to be a human, because they certainly have classes on the biopsychosocial model, but I think we could do a little bit more. And it's great to see your webinar out there helping people tap more into the human side of what we do. And the other word is community. How important it is to have a community behind what it is you're doing. It's amazing. You're a staple in your community in the side of home care, and you need a community behind you to be that person, to be able to support people through really tough times, getting back into their home after leaving a hospital. And I think we could do more of that. Last kind of thing, the digital world, online world, it's very difficult to create community because there's so much noise. How do we leverage the human experience and community and social psychology online?
That's a great question.
Sorry.
Another. It's a very difficult question to answer. I think the key is producing content that is emotionally that touches people's emotions, like you mentioned. And I know for myself, I mean, I post a lot on LinkedIn. I posted a lot of ads on LinkedIn, but I recently posted about that patient that I was working with. Obviously, I didn't give any details for
Yeah.
HIPAA considerations,
Yeah.
but I got a lot more responses, a lot more views than I've ever gotten. So you see that connecting with people is the best way to connect with people. And what interests people the most is emotional things that touch their emotions. And that's how you express the human side of PT, by showing, for example, what I'm speaking to you about on this podcast, how I had this patient and how I connected with him through music. So I try to share that through LinkedIn, and that's the best way. You want to show the human element of yourself. You want to find commonality with others, and I think that's the best way to connect with others through social media. And what I've noticed, I just started. I was never a social media person
Hmm.
until Psychology for the Body, but I've actually made a lot of inroads in LinkedIn. I've been using that the most, and a lot of people have reached out to me, and I've had a lot of conversations with people about IO, about various topics. So I've noticed that there is a possibility, there is an openness to the ability, and we never had this before in terms of community. On the one hand, like you mentioned, on the one hand, it's harder to make connections because there's a lack of humanity or human elements because you're using social media. But there's so much more availability now. There's so many more PTs that I can connect with that I couldn't have connected with 25 years ago. So yes, you're missing something in terms of the human element, but you have to fill in that gap by sharing these stories and sharing, like for me, sharing the human aspects and human side of physical therapy and being a physical therapist. And you also have to take advantage of the fact that now you can expose yourself from an advertising standpoint, and also just from sharing knowledge to so many more people that you couldn't have done in the past.
You hit the word story, telling a story and an emotional connection to that story. And I think we think of storytelling more on the marketing side, but on the side of treating and working with individuals going through their challenges, telling them stories is tremendously impactful too. Sharing a story you had, of course, in a safe way, can have a tremendous impact to develop that rapport. I always tell a story. My grandmother, who's 90 years old, she had back pain, and how she overcame the back pain thinking it was never going to go away, and it just disappeared. And I always tell people that story, and they always have an emotional connection to it. They're like thinking of grandma, and they're thinking of her probably, being in pain, and me, the grandson physical therapist, telling her it's just going to get better. And then magically it got better, and everybody wants it to magically get better. And so it helps them connect to it, and it builds their confidence in themselves a little bit if grandma can do it. So tell stories. And also, I'm sorry to go on a soapbox, but Ari, what he's done is so impressive because you've created this LinkedIn profile. You said you got onto LinkedIn a few months ago, right? You said,
Yeah, a couple months ago. Yeah, 3 months ago.
and
Yeah.
you got onto LinkedIn, you put your stuff out there, you put your content out there, you told your story of how you're applying psychology. I saw it pop up, and all of a sudden, a few months later, you're doing these weekly webinars, you're creating this brand, you're attracting the right people by just using, the story of what it is you're doing. And I think a lot of clinicians are putting content out there that they think they need to be, this is what people want, or this is how I have to come out, or this is how I have to come off, instead of just tapping into what their story is and sharing that story. So,
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to mention one more point at the towards the end here. So I was just talking to my friend, my colleague Nathan, who I spoke about earlier, who's also the IO, and we were talking about leadership and a leadership attitude. And one of the key elements of being a leader is having a growth mindset and not a fixed mindset.
mm-hmm.
And I used to be like that. I used to be an individual with a fixed mindset.
Really?
I used to have a fixed mindset, and then I would come home and I would complain, and there were certain aspects of my job that I was burnt out about, and then finally, I would say I have a very supportive family, a supportive wife, but finally, she said to me, you've been talking about, exploring this aspect of psychology for so long, stop being fixed, it's time to grow. So that's where it changed for me. It just changed a couple years ago, and then I decided to go back to school. And it's really important to have that growth mindset, to constantly believe that there's more to learn, and to follow your passion and not just accept reality as it is right now, but pursue more.
That's my
that would
message. I love
yeah.
it. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, for patients out there, for clinicians out there, yes, that is what it's about, to grow through some of the uncomfortable experiences we have, whether it's physically, whether it's emotionally as a clinician with burnout. How do you leverage that? And you learn to, and for me, I'm so fascinated by psychology. So let me ask you a quick question. Is your wife in education?
My wife is a speech
Ah,
therapist.
okay.
She
Okay.
works with children,
Okay.
but she's also very psychologically insightful.
Okay. Because
She doesn't have a technical degree in psychology, but she pretty much I've been married for 15 years,
nice.
and we've gone through our ups and downs. Actually, I had a really tragic story. Unfortunately, I had a child that passed away, so that was really difficult for us.
Sorry to hear
Yeah.
that.
But thankfully, I have a great wife, fantastic. We've been married for 15 years, very supportive, and she's really been helping me, and we drive each other, and we've been bonding for so many years, and she's really a really strong motivator for me. So yeah, so she's not in psychology herself, but I would say that she's a psychologist just in her nature, by
Wow.
nature.
So you and your wife must be a dream team together to have gone through something so tragic, and on the other side of it somehow growing through it, and you on the side of getting your degree in Io Psychology, your wife also as a speech therapist working with children. I couldn't imagine how that impacts your day-to-day empathetic connection you have with who those you work with. I think it's so important to work with people that are really connected. I'm really grateful that you and I connected. It's funny for people to know that I just kind of saw Psychology for the Body. I'm sorry, I might have said it wrong earlier in the episode. I saw, New Jersey. So interesting, just a little psychology here, okay? I saw the word psychology and I saw New Jersey. And automatically, I'm like, I need to connect with this guy. Now, in the UK, I connect with a lot of people. So it's not, but when I saw Jersey and I saw psychology, I'm like, I have to connect with this guy. I'm going to, and I sent you multiple messages because I wanted to make sure that we connected. And so it's interesting creating that common ground. It's so simple as me just seeing on your LinkedIn profile, being able to put things out there that can attract those that you're probably best to connect with. I learning more of your story, doing this podcast, I hear people's story, and above everything, I just love getting to know people's, journey and how they've used it to overcome difficult, challenging situations and growing from it. So I hope this inspires clinicians out there too. Like, go get outside the box. I was just on a podcast called the Beyond PT podcast, where PTs are sharing their experiences going beyond the clinical side. And hats off to you, Ari. Amazing
Thank
work.
you.
Amazing
Thank
work.
you so much. Really appreciate you having me on your podcast.
Ari, thank you for coming on. I really think that this is going to impact so many clinicians and patients that are interested in learning psychology and rehab. Everybody out there, listen up. How do they find you? How do they get to you?
So you can check out my website at psychologyforthebody.com. You can email me at easypsychologyforthebody@gmail.com. You can even call me if you want. I'll leave my phone number, 347-249-5103. And or you can check out my LinkedIn profile. I'd love it if you connected with me on LinkedIn. The more people that connect, the better. The more exposure to the advertisements, the webinars, the stories that I share. So just check me out on LinkedIn. So looking forward to connecting with more people.
So if it's Monday, January 11th, then Ari has his webinar going live. You do it live, right?
Yeah, I do them live because in New Jersey, this one is for New York PTs and
Okay.
many other PTs where there's reciprocity, but in New Jersey, there's one of the aspects of continuing education is you need a certain amount of live credits. So I have 2 courses for New Jersey clinicians that are both live as well.
Well, anybody that's listening to this, I want you to go watch Ari's webinar because I think everybody can learn. So anybody that's interested in my podcast has a lot to learn from this webinar, and you'll be able to connect with Ari. And so I think that's absolutely great. I already gone through one of his webinars. I'll probably tune into another one, have it on at least in the background, because I'm sure you'll say things a little bit differently. By the way, last thing, hats off to you to do all these live webinars, man. They're not easy. You really put yourself out there. I've done a lot of research in the online marketing world and stuff, and there's evergreen content, and then there's live launching, and you're essentially live launching twice a week. So you're doing.
I actually love it. I love teaching. Little side point. I know we're coming to the end here,
Yes.
but I was a teacher for a year, a high school teacher for a year.
Right.
So I've always loved teaching.
Right.
I love organizing my thoughts, putting them on a PowerPoint slides. I just love it. I actually enjoy it. That's the best part of teaching other clinicians and sharing my knowledge with them. So yeah, it's a work of passion for me. Like, I really enjoy it.
Awesome. All right. Well, I won't take any more of your time today. I'll let you get to your next webinar. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And we'll talk soon, my friend.